All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of the Skeptical Human podcast. I'm your host, a skeptical human. Joining me today is Socrates of Athína. Today we will be discussing the drug war, artificial intelligence, and skepticism. Socrates of Athína is a YouTuber, philosopher, and a skeptic. Socrates, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Would you like to expand a bit on that introduction? A little more on your background, perhaps?
Yes. Specifically with the use of the term philosopher. I'm not an academic philosopher. However, I do think the requirement of identifying as a philosopher, having credentials is a little bit ridiculous. But that hinges on how I define philosopher. And I define it as just someone who conducts rational inquiry into various subjects. So really anyone could be a philosopher. In my mind, you don't need credentials for that. Of course, regardless, that comes with reading a lot of literature and philosophy. And listening to all sorts of lecture series on YouTube, which are now publicly available, thanks to Stanford University and other universities that are now putting up their lecture series on YouTube.
All right. Is there any specific website or Twitter handle or anything that you want to give the listeners so that they can get into contact with you?
Just my YouTube channel.
All right. And what is that one more time?
Socrates of Athína.
All right. Great. Now let's get into it. I was wanting to start out with the drug war. I view this as one of the most important public policy issues of our time, and I also, unfortunately, think it's not talked about nearly as much as it should be. And what little discussion you do see in the mainstream, it's painfully limited in scope, in my view.
Well, they also, if you notice with most news media, they don't intend to invite philosophers to discuss anything, really. In fact, they're entirely ignored.
Mm-hmm.
What they tend to do instead are invite political pundits and people who will just sell you, pre-planned lines that they've researched and figured, people will respond well to this. Not very helpful, in my opinion, especially when they invite people in the federal government like the FBI to talk about these matters, because the only thing they're concerned about really is incarceration. So, of course, they're usually going to be very much opposed to legalization, because it keeps their numbers up and justifies their inflated budgets.
Right. All right, I'm just going to ask you this very straightforward question, and we'll just take it from there, I guess. Do you think certain recreational drugs should be against the law, and why or why not?
I do not, actually. For countries that have legalized drugs, the problems associated with criminal activity, with drug use, tend to fall through the floor. So, rates of violent crime, of which about half of people in our prisons currently in the United States for drug possession or trafficking, which is a very legally vague term,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to commit crimes to get money for drugs. And another curious thing is that when drugs are legal, of course, they're going to have a much more inflated cost.
Right.
If you go to countries where certain drugs are legal, the cost of buying marijuana, for example, very, very cheap. And we're, of course, seeing that in states that have legalized marijuana as well.
Yeah, definitely. And when you push it into a black market, like what we currently have, the problem is, well, one of many problems, I should say, since the prices are so much higher, because you're paying for the risk, depending upon the drug, you're paying for growing it in a different country, the hassle of smuggling it. Since the prices are inflated in that way, one of many consequences of this is that you see crime rates go up in this country, as you touched on, because people who are addicted, let's say to heroin, for example, they need to go out and get a certain amount of money per day to be able to support their habit. So If we had a legalized system where the prices were a lot lower than in the black market, we would see a drastic reduction in crime.
And specifically when we're talking about reduction in crime, of course, obviously, if you legalize a certain drug, it's no longer a crime and crimes drop. I'm specifically,
Touche.
I'm specifically referring to cases where drug possession is combined with other types of crimes. So specifically with intent to like get money for drugs or to sell drugs and things like that. In some other illegal capacity, just possessing or selling the drug is irrelevant to that distinction.
Yeah,
And
sorry, go on.
oh no, I was just saying I don't have statistics up for it, unfortunately, but I was reading an article just before this on Portugal's drug legalization, and a
Yes.
lot of their violent crimes fell through the floor once they did that.
Yeah, definitely. There were two countries that I had in mind to mention here in this discussion, Holland and Portugal. Holland decriminalized drugs, and one thing that you always hear from drug warriors, people in support of the drug war, one thing you always hear them say is if we legalize drugs, if we decriminalize drugs, drug usage is going to skyrocket. And what instead that we saw in Holland was drug usage went down, believe it or not. In Portugal, which also decriminalized all drugs, I believe, drug usage, according to the information I came across, roughly stayed the same, but problem drug usage, addiction, criminally supported drug usage, that actually went down. So when people say, "Oh, if we legalize drugs, it's just going to be chaos and people are going to use drugs like crazy," I just think that's not supported by statistics and frankly ridiculous. I mean, all we have to do is ask ourselves if we woke up tomorrow and we opened up the newspaper and we saw that it said all drugs now legal. Who would say, "Oh, wonderful! Let's get the wife and kids together and let's go buy some crystal methamphetamine"? I actually view this argument that we need drugs to be criminalized in order to keep people from using them. I view this as actually extremely condescending because what it's basically saying is, oh, I might be smart enough to not use these drugs, but other people less intelligent than me, if they were legal, they're so stupid and uneducated, and they can't think for themselves. That they would just go out and start shooting up heroin. I actually view it as very condescending. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that it is condescending, so we do agree there. The other thing that factors heavily into this is, as I was writing about before, the rat paradise study, which unfortunately I also found has not been able to be replicated. But basically, what this study did was it put rats in a cage with access to morphine and regular water, and of course they took to the morphine like nobody's business because they were in an unstimulating environment.
Right.
Put them in the rat paradise with a bunch of other rats and a bunch of things to do, and their drug usage will usually decrease or stop. That's what that one study found. Unfortunately, I found two other studies on PubMed which claim to be unable to replicate those findings, so I think the jury is a little bit out on that.
Uh-huh.
You'll, of course, find YouTube videos and pro-drug legalization advocates aplenty, parroting that rat paradise study, but I think a lot more research needs to be done, specifically on causes of addiction. Now, of course, one thing that is established in humans with causes of addiction is high-stress environments lead to drug usage more often than not. In fact, it's probably the number one indicator of when one will probably start to use drugs. And that does factor heavily into drugs and other crimes, because if you're in a high-stress environment, well, already you're doing something illegal just by possessing drugs. And that is going to chronically stress you out. So, and then having to get money to purchase those drugs, well, that's another concern. If there's no stress at all, however, another important thing to mention here is that the United States used to have federally funded rehabilitation centers. They used to have federally funded grants for clean needles that they would give out to heroin users to prevent AIDS. Of course, about 80% of AIDS cases, I think, were the result of heroin needles.
Yeah, it's
Um,
it's it's a surprising percentage. Yeah.
it's a very large percentage. So, when you do have federal funding for things like rehabilitation centers, clean needles, and other things that would, at face value, seem to support drug use, what actually happens is drug use declines, and you have much less economic cost with people needing to go, to emergency rooms or get treatment for HIV and other blood transmissible diseases.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. A lot of good stuff that you put on the table. I'm going to jump back briefly to the rat paradise point that you made and drug addiction and usage triggers, because I do have a few more things to say about that. There are a couple different points of data, points of research that I think still do support the idea that drug usage tends to be stimulated when you're in an unstimulating or stressful environment. One of them specifically is during Vietnam, soldiers were using heroin quite a bit. Heroin usage was actually quite rampant. And at the time, when the war was coming close to an end, uh, the United States government was quite worried that we would have this flood of heroin addicted soldiers coming back to the States. But when they actually left that high stress environment where they have to worry about walking out into the bush and getting killed the next day, when they actually came back home to their family and friends and the suburbs and so forth, most of them just dropped the habit with no problem. Now
Yeah.
that's one of the things I wanted to mention. Um, Another thing related to that subject is it's actually some research that I recently heard on the radio. I can't remember exactly where I heard this, but the basic finding of the study was that one of the main uh, predictors of whether a person will relapse was whether or not they lived in a boring place, plain and simple. If they had stuff to do where they lived, they were more likely to not fall back to using drugs, which I found interesting. I have some more to say about the other stuff you mentioned, but I'm just going to leave it
Well,
there for now and
first
see
of
if you have
all,
anything to say.
yeah, so I can keep that in memory. First of all, the problem with the Vietnam study is there is one major confounding factor to it that I have not seen addressed by anybody commenting about it on the internet so far,
Uh huh.
and that is the general unavailability of the drug. Like, these are Vietnam veterans, very young Vietnam veterans, usually around the age of 24, returning home. They would not have any idea, really, on how to go about purchasing heroin, for example.
I,
And
I
most
I
of
would I would
these
have to disagree with that objection to it, but go on.
Well, I'm simply saying that most of these people would probably return to areas, a lot of them rural, for example. Back then, more Americans lived in rural communities than they do today. And you would have to find some way of transporting heroin quite a long distance for a lot of them. And that is it's just one of those confounding factors that wasn't explored in that study.
Uh huh.
And the original study, it wasn't really a study, it was an investigation by two congressmen, I believe it was.
Okay.
So these are not scientists, and it was a questionnaire, though, and it was aided by scientists, of course, in sending out those surveys. So
Now,
that there's just certain things that weren't controlled for in that situation. Now,
sure, sure.
as to the boring environment thing, that also has the confounding factor of what constitutes a boring environment might also include high levels of stress. And if you can tell me whether or not that study, controlled for that confounding factor, like, did it mention relative reports of stress in daily life? Because poverty tends to be the main predictor of what is a boring environment, in my experience in reading literature like this.
Yeah, with that study, I can't remember the specifics. It was just a summary that I heard on the radio several months back, so I'm not sure. But with going back to the Vietnam soldiers, now I think you did actually make a good point that a lot of them were returning to rural areas where it'd be more difficult to access the drug. That's actually something I've never considered, and I think that is definitely a confounding variable.
Yeah,
But
especially
with
because we just don't know how many of them, like, where were they, is the thing I want to know. Like, what are the locational demographics of this study? That would actually be very helpful in determining that confounding factor specifically, and also the availability of heroin or estimates thereof in what areas they were largely based in. Now, the study says it was a randomized selection, but without having access to data on where these soldiers were, there's no real way to determine if the location was randomized.
Sure, sure. There was a but there though. Uh, Now, yes, many of them may have been from rural areas, but I was going to say, I think as long as you don't live, let's say, out in some isolated farm, uh, I think it's going to be pretty easy to find somebody to supply you with drugs, because there's always going to be a demand, and given how profitable this industry is, there are going to be people that meet that demand. Now, small farm towns, I don't know how it was in the 70s, but even these days, nowadays, uh, people living in farms and tiny communities. There have been some towns with 50 people, and police have busted dealers there. Even small towns, you can still find people who are willing to supply the drug.
Point
All that
on
matters
that,
is
though.
if there is demand, somebody will supply it. That's my point.
Well, yeah. Point on that, though, is the very recent phenomenon mostly deals with methamphetamine. Heroin is not so easy to produce nor procure. Methamphetamine is one of those drugs you can produce with things you can buy over the counter. Heroin production, I believe, is a lot more involved, especially due to the size of the field you need to actually get a decent quantity.
Right.
And the vast majority of it is imported from Mexico, which would have definitely been the same thing back during the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
Also, heroin production was actually it was rather low back then to begin with. Availability of heroin in Vietnam was simply because, well, they already had a pre-existing problem with heroin production.
Right. Yeah. They were just much closer to it as well because it was grown in a lot of Asian countries, if I recall.
Yeah, so real problem here is trying to determine how big of a factor those confounding variables would have had
Sure.
on the
Sure.
resulting findings. Now,
Okay.
I mention this because this is one of those things that I would support in theory. In fact, it's one of those things I would like to believe,
Yes.
but without further research and without knowledge of demographics and what I previously mentioned, there's no way to be certain. And certainty is one of those very important things when discussing, scientific findings or ideas that people generally want to advocate. And especially with pro-legalization people, when they bring up things like this, they need to be aware of where the weaknesses in these research studies are,
I
in order
agree.
to
Yeah.
preempt, the very obvious criticism, which usually it doesn't even get to the criticism phase, because most of the times with these political pundits, they're going to be like, "Oh, you just advocate for drug usage," No mention of other countries that have legalized drugs whatsoever.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I definitely think that is a very intellectually honest position to take, and I think that's what everyone should do. Is like you said, find the weaknesses in their arguments, know what's wrong with arguments that people on their side are making, so that they can stop them from being made, and instead make actually good arguments. I'm totally with you there. Now, I wanted to jump back actually to something you talked about earlier that I had written down here. You were talking about federally funded treatment and supplying of needles and so forth, and I wanted to jump back to that. Now, currently, if my understanding is correct, in the United States, needle exchange programs they don't exist. Uh, Needles used to inject drugs are extremely hard to come by in the United States, to my understanding. And what happens is you have people swapping dirty needles because they're in short supply, and you have diseases like hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, AIDS being transmitted. And like you said earlier, this is causing a huge spike in the transmission of these diseases. And keep in mind, it's not just a bunch of filthy drug users, as some people make it out to be. It's not just people who use the drugs that get these diseases. It's their sexual partners. It's if they get pregnant and have a child, their children get this disease passed on. So this it's just not true that it's only confined to the drug using population.
And I would, one of the most important points to make there as well is the problem in general in the United States with this bizarre scenario of, oh, you're using drugs, therefore you deserve it.
Exactly.
If you're going to make a case and claim that drugs are legitimately addictive, like we're going to go with the crazy narrative of this is your brain on drugs, that it legitimately does have absolutely addicting properties, even marijuana or LSD or whatever, which are generally non-physically addictive. They can be psychologically addictive, sure. But if you're going to make that argument, then you cannot also make an argument of personal agency. And this is an important little contradiction that most of these politicians tend to double think through. So if it is truly addictive, then they don't have agency to stop using, and therefore you can't actually punish them because they're no longer making a choice of free will. They're no longer making a conscious choice.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Technically, that means they are clinically insane because they're no longer capable of rational thought, they're no longer capable of making actual decisions. So if it is truly addictive, if it is truly incapable to not be addicted to, you are not justified in blaming them for it. And you are definitely not justified in removing programs that would help prevent spread of diseases and rehabilitate them.
Yeah, I'm actually personally quite disturbed at the rampant demonization of drug users that you see in society. Uh, I mean, a lot of these people, they're not bad people. They're not irredeemable people. You know, heroin addicts, they didn't start out. They didn't want to end up as a heroin addict. They didn't want to end up dying of an overdose with a needle in their arm. These people aren't irredeemable. There have been plenty of former drug addicts who have turned their life around and ended up doing great things, ended up being a very productive member of society. So this whole idea that we just take drug users and instead of trying to help them get their life back on track, and instead we just lock them up in prison, I think that's frankly ridiculous.
There's a corollary here as well to the general habit of our government defunding useful programs. One of which, and I can't remember which politician this was for the life of me, and Google is currently not being helpful. But at one point, we used to have a program that allowed, felons and other long-stay prisoners to get funding and grants for college and university education. And there were entire whole businesses all over the country centered around, giving these people educational material and degrees and things like that. And so you would have prisoners who were there for 8 years, leaving with 2 or 3 different degrees and being highly employable, making a lot of money afterward, and they would not return. There would be no recidivism from that group. I can't remember which politician it was or when this was, but we canceled that program.
Wow, I can't believe that. I've never heard of that program, and that's just mind-boggling that it would get canceled. And there have also been some programs within prisons and jails, certain programs that instead of just letting people rot in jail in prison, they attend classes. They try to learn socialization skills. They teach them anger management. They teach them how to function in a work environment. They just taught them all sorts of life skills. And with this group of people that attended these classes, after they left prison, both their recidivism rates and their drug usage rates afterwards were dramatically lower than people who didn't attend the classes. I can't remember the exact figures, but
Well,
it's enough to be it's enough to make these programs worth funding. But instead, what you saw was only a tiny fraction of the prisoners were allowed to enter into that program. Let's say it was a prison of, let's say, like 4,000 people. Only a couple hundred people at most could attend the classes. We should have every single prisoner, I would argue, being taught these sort of life skills. This isn't exactly strictly a drug war argument. It's more just about prison in general. But I think
related to
it's yeah. But I think that's something we should definitely be focusing our energy on.
Also, to be specific, I did find it. The elimination of inmate education. It was the Higher Education Act of 1965. And of course, this is another case of those, what a misnomer. But it snuck in a little amendment, one single amendment, that completely destroyed the whole penal education system. And that was, it amended one section, and it says, no basic grant shall be awarded under this subpart to any individual who is incarcerated in any federal or state penal institution. Additionally, something that not everyone will know, if you have a felony, you can no longer receive federal funding or grants, so far as I know. You can get a federal loan unless you have been convicted for some sort of financial fraud or something like that. But yeah, that one little line completely reversed all the progress that was made by having that in place.
That's a
And it
shame.
was in a bill titled Higher Education Act of 1965.
Yeah. Now, if we could, I wanted to jump back to something you very briefly touched on it, but I think it's a very important point for our side of the argument to make. I'll pose it in the form of a question to you. Is favoring an alternative to prohibition an endorsement of drug usage?
Considering the fact that once you lift prohibition, usage goes down, it's empirically not. And one other thing is that a lot of politicians and such will make arguments to refute, using other countries as an example, of, oh, that's just a different culture, it won't work here. I've heard that argument and read it quite a bit. To which the common reply I've seen is, well, America had prohibition of alcohol. At which point you'll get, oh, alcohol's a different thing. It's a different time. Even though alcohol is implicated in far more crimes than other drugs, and far more mortalities, and has far worse adverse health effects.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one thing I would add to that, while I support ending drug prohibition, I don't support drug usage. I don't want people to go out and use drugs. I don't want people to shoot up heroin, smoke meth, etc. All I'm doing is simply recognizing that regardless of our laws, people are going to use these drugs. The demand will always be there. Something like 5% of the world population uses illegal drugs. And no matter how many laws you pass, no matter how strict of legal penalties you impose, no matter what you make the prison sentences, no matter how many drug dealers you arrest, the demand is always going to be there, and there's always going to be somebody to supply it. So I would argue that the drug war we're not just fighting an uphill battle. It is a fundamentally unwinnable battle. Because the demand will always stay there. And all I'm doing is just recognizing this fact and saying, okay, what can we do? Toss people in jail, criminalize it, leading to all sorts of adverse health effects, the rise of gangs, and so forth. Or can we legalize it, regulate these drugs, take the the production, the manufacture, and the sale of these drugs out of the hands of gangs and thugs and cartels and criminal organizations, and instead put it in the hands of either the government or reputable manufacturers with responsible chemists and experienced medical scientists who know what they're doing and know how to manufacture these drugs. And to me, I mean, the answer to that question, it's a no-brainer. It's clearly legalization is the best answer to it.
Well, also to save money on taxes, for example. I mean, currently we're operating at a loss funding, for federal prisons alone, the year 2015 budget request was $8.5 billion. And that's just for operating federal prisons. I could not find figures on how much probation, parole, drug testing, and everything costs. Drug testing companies, however, are making out like bandits. Total bandits, especially with the little controversial mishap there when they added drug testing into, welfare, which operated at even more of a loss. I think Florida, for example, only caught, 100, something around 100 individuals, and the total cost to that didn't outweigh the savings of kicking those individuals off.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Because the majority of people on welfare obviously can't afford drugs.
Yeah, to expand on that tax point, in general, the whole drug war effort, I would argue, is a tremendous waste of taxpayer money and law enforcement resources and the court system, judges, juries, and so forth. All of that is just wasted money and wasted time, in my opinion. I don't know how accurate this statistic is, but if I recall correctly, since the inception of the drug war, our government has spent something like $1 trillion fighting this drug war.
I've seen figures ranging from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. However, I did try to substantiate those, and I cannot find the study that came to that conclusion for the life of me.
Okay. Well, regardless of what the specific figure is, we know it to be a tremendous amount because, like you said, billions are requested annually to fund this war. And again, to reiterate, remember, this is a fundamentally unwinnable war. I think it's actually worthwhile to just take a minute and consider what would it mean to win the drug war? What would winning the drug war consist of?
Well, it's the same question you would pose to getting involved, for example, with the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. What does winning actually entail? And that was a question that was never answered, so far as I know.
Yeah,
another point to bring up, too, is that it single-handedly inflates our prison and jail population astronomically. Looking right here at the statistics for 2006 for felony sentences in state courts, 33% of those felony convictions in state courts in 2006 were for drug offenses.
Wow.
So that's 33.4%. And you can access all of these statistics, at the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. They have loads of statistics on everything for practically every single year. And so you can find budgetary estimates, budget requests, pretty much everything they collect is all there.
Yeah, also to expand a little bit more on that, winning the drug war point, it seems like to win would be to completely eradicate the manufacture of these drugs, the sale of these drugs, and the usage of these drugs. It seems like winning the drug war would mean making it so that illegal drugs are not used, or everybody who uses them or sells them is tossed into prison. Ask yourself, how much would we have to spend? How much effort would it take to imprison roughly 5% of our population? Something like 100 million Americans have smoked marijuana. Are we going to imprison every single one of them? I mean, I don't think many of the people in favor of the drug war have even stopped to consider what it would mean to win. I mean, we would just have to toss a third of the country into prison. It's and many politicians as well. We have George Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, people who favor the drug war, who admit that they have used drugs in the past. A point I always make, it's kind of a cheat point, but if these people really want to set an example, why don't they lead by example and voluntarily incarcerate themselves? After all, they are violating the very laws that they're enforcing and throwing millions of people into jail for.
And another point to make is if they admitted to drug usage in the past, they're simply lucky that statute of limitations has run out. And the funny thing is, there are various legislative attempts to increase statute of limitations just to arrest even more people. So if you ever admit to using drugs in the past and say they increase statute of limitations to, say, from 5 years to 20, you better hope it was in the far past.
Right. No, I wasn't implying by that that if you admit to using drugs, that's a criminal offense. Like I said, it was a cheap point. But it's I think there is some truth to it, though.
There is more to a philosophical point of view, though. When it comes to something like prosecuting drug use, what you're really doing is attempting to punish out of existence what is inherently a victimless crime, as far as just drug possession and use is concerned. And there's kind of a bizarre doublethink going on here, because I pulled up as well average sentencing for state courts for drug trafficking. And trafficking is federally defined simply by quantity held. That is all that is really needed to establish intent to sell, is the amount of a given drug you have. Now, drug trafficking has the exact same average prison time as larceny, and slightly more than motor vehicle theft, for example. And in some cases, it has more of an average prison sentence than fraud and forgery. Sometimes it's more than burglary. Depending on the state, it can be even longer than a rape charge. Because I looked up some statistics, and it was about 11 years on average for a rape charge, and for some drug charges, it can be upwards of 13 years.
Yeah, it's astounding.
Just possession. And for people who break 3 strikes laws, they can get life in prison, which is the same charge you would give to somebody who committed a homicide. So, morally speaking, they are claiming that just being caught using drugs 3 times in a row is the moral equivalent of murdering somebody. That is the kind of thought we put into our criminal justice system at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is important just to view it from a very basic philosophical point of view and just ask, should we make it a criminal offense to use a drug that may harm your health, but that's not going to have much of an effect on anybody else except for yourself? And obviously, I think the answer is no to that question, but I think it's interesting to point out the inconsistency on our government's part, because alcohol and tobacco, which are responsible for about 500,000 deaths a year, those are perfectly legal. You can go to the liquor store, you can go to the gas station, you can buy booze, you can buy cigarettes, totally acceptable. Smoke marijuana, you get thrown in prison. You get busted with cocaine, criminal offense, probation, perhaps, potentially jail time. I just think there's no consistency here. And if anything, people who make the health arguments in favor of the drug war should be spending a sizable amount of their energy arguing that alcohol and tobacco be criminalized, because these drugs are responsible for vastly more deaths than all currently illegal drugs combined, by a long shot. So, like I said, there's just no consistency here on this point.
And if there was, I mean, again, look at America's prohibition on alcohol and how well that went. That was an utter disaster. So that is something we definitely want to avoid. Bizarrely enough, another study I read quite recently, in fact, on a more recent timescale, found that as marijuana has been legalized, other types of drug usage has actually gone down
Interesting.
in the past couple of years. So it's kind of a funny little phenomenon. The other thing I think bears mentioning in terms of ethics is that we still have plenty of people who are in prison and jail for possession of marijuana in states where it has been legalized.
Wow.
You Our laws do not retroactively exonerate you on the basis that you broke the law at the time.
Yeah, that's astounding. I would have just assumed that those people would have been pardoned. I had no idea that they were
No,
still in
no.
jail in those states. That's mind-boggling.
And it's yeah, no, there again, when I mentioned that they never really bring philosophers on the news, this is another scenario where there have been a lot of talks, you know, between philosophers in schools of ethics and so forth, which have argued very similar points. And you even have justices and police officials also arguing for legalization of these things because they end up arresting people that they know personally are good people, sending them to jail or prison, and when they come back, then they start committing actual crimes.
Yeah, and another thing to point out is when you throw people in jail for a drug offense, you're only going to make it harder for them when they come out. Because let's say they had a job at the
Oh,
time, chances are they're not going to have that job afterwards. I mean, what job is okay with you taking, let's say, a 1 year leave of absence? Most a lot of jobs, let's just say a lot of jobs are going to let people go if they get sent to prison. Once you come out of prison, once you have that on your record, it's obviously going to be more difficult for you to find a job, making it more likely that you're going to end up resorting to a life of crime. And furthermore, we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons. Drug usage is still surprisingly common in prisons. And so you have people in prisons who are still using these drugs. So there's just a lot of different variables stacked up against these people.
yeah, the lifetime punishment of carrying a felony is pretty ridiculous, especially as punishments for felonies in a lot of cases have been reduced to mere probation. So you have people getting felonies and only getting sentenced to, say, a year on probation, for example. So a felony, as it was originally intended, is no longer for, say, treason or assassination. It's handed out like candy. Amounts of felonies have increased as much as 80% over the past couple decades. So we're punishing, lesser and lesser crimes at the felony level with mandatory minimum sentences, and it just creates this terrible recurring melt. So, regardless of your moral objections to potential drug legalization, you can't ignore the empirical cost here. And that is something I very much wish I could have a reasonable conversation with somebody about. But usually it ends up devolving into a sort of bizarre tautology. It's currently the law, you should obey the law is just because it's the law, things like that. You find a lot of tautological reasoning when you also watch videos on law enforcement, judges, and so forth discussing the law, especially with prosecutors. And to a degree, I swear that's just so they can sleep at night. Because you
Yeah.
have to ignore a lot of your own personal experiences and statistics and just general reasonable arguments in order to be continuously sentencing, prosecuting, and harming these people and their families and their friends and their entire lives.
Right. If I could just stop you there, though, to be fair, many judges and law enforcement officers recognize the folly of this policy, and you
Well,
have
yeah.
you have you have plenty of people within the system who are staunchly opposed to this because they more than anyone see the harm that it causes. They more than anyone see people getting sent to jail and taken away from their families for drug possession. Like you always hear, "Oh, think of the children." Well, what about the children whose mother uh, got sent to prison for a year for drug possession? It's kind of going off on a tangent here, but to return to the original point, um, a lot of people within the system do agree with us that this is a failed policy.
And some politicians as well. But one
Not
of the
enough.
recurring, one of the recurring problems with politics and where it differs from just having an argument is in order to get elected, you have to appeal to some extent to the masses. And one of the few works that I don't utterly loathe from Noam Chomsky was an article he wrote detailing what happened during Ronald Reagan's presidency when he started pushing this war on drugs narrative. One of the and they did voter surveys on what voters cared about. And after Ronald Reagan pushed the media into doing, this is your brain on drugs style demonization of drug use, concern over drugs went from something like 2% of the surveyed population to something like 54% of the surveyed population were
Wow.
very concerned about it. So it was a very effective media campaign, and just like one of those stranger danger campaigns. So we have a lot of examples where trumped up fear with no actual data to support it has been used for political advantage. Because if you
Yeah,
can make somebody afraid of something and then run on a ballot that says you will solve that thing, more often than not, you're going to get a lot of votes.
yeah, and it's not just during the Reagan era that we saw that sort of thing. Uh, Even to this day, we still see all sorts of propaganda uh, spewed by drug warriors, but this was especially problematic during the origin of the drug war. That's when you saw just the most absurd, ridiculous propaganda imaginable. Like Reefer Madness, for example. That was a government-sponsored film. Just
Yeah.
pure rubbish. It's just nonsense. Harry J. Anslinger, who was the head of uh, one of the government bureaus tasked with clamping down on drug usage, he would regularly write articles that would be published in newspapers saying ridiculous nonsense like, "Oh yes, somebody the other day smoked marijuana and went insane and killed his family with an axe," and there was just the most unsupported garbage being pumped out in the newspapers, in films. And if you actually go back and study the origins of the drug war, you see that the reasoning was not sound. It wasn't based on very good intentions. Oftentimes, the motives were actually racist.
Well, I
Those
don't know, but
Chinamen want to get your wife hooked on opium and have sex with her. Those Mexicans and those blacks want your wife to smoke the reefer, and they want to have sex with her. Oftentimes, the motives were shockingly racist. So,
I don't know about the racism bits, but one minor correction.
yeah,
I made a big goof here. It was Richard Nixon, not Ronald Reagan. Somebody is gonna kill me for that, but no, it was Richard Nixon in about 1971.
sure, yeah,
The whole declared war on drugs thing. Richard Nixon.
formally. Yeah, prior to that, we were still engaged in all sorts of anti-drug efforts, but the formal declaration, yeah, it occurred
Well,
during his presidency.
some prehistory to that deals with this sort of philosophy we've adopted as a country over time, which is the tough on crime idea.
Yeah,
And that idea essentially says that if you're tough on crime, you will discourage criminals from doing what they do. What ends up happening instead is you make the crime more risky and therefore more valuable. And so, of course, you actually end up with a market economy where scarcity drives up cost, drives up demand.
yeah, that's
So, it's really a matter of economics, in my view.
Yeah, the real irony here with our drug policy is nobody would support this more than the cartels and the gangs and the criminal organizations
Oh, they love it.
who profit immensely from this. They make millions of dollars off of this policy because, like you said, it's just a matter of economics. It's that I think is one of the great ironies of this whole issue.
Yeah. So I actually take a more utilitarian and pragmatic view in this, is that if you want the thing to go away, just legalize it. Although I do want to mention one minor point with legalization so far, is that there actually isn't any regulations on, say, marijuana, for example. Not sufficiently, anyway. So if you had a reliable drug dealer before, for example, and he would give you a specific strain of marijuana or whatever, and it was had a certain THC percentage and so forth, there aren't really any regulations in place that require current sellers and distribution centers to tell you the truth about a given strain that they're selling. For all you know, they could all be the exact same thing, and they could all have no THC whatsoever in them.
Huh. But before we jump into legalization and regulation, I was wanting to go back a bit and just expand a bit more on some of the harm that results from our process of criminalization. Um,
Well, that all goes back, again, specifically to the tough on crime philosophy. And that goes back to the Kerner Commission, which it was named after Governor Otto Kerner Jr., specifically of Illinois, and it was made by the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. It was an 11-member commission established by President Johnson for recommendations on dealing with race riots, actually. And among its numerous suggestions, it recommended confronting institutional racism at the time. But in spite of that commission, it was actually, again, Richard Nixon who got elected on the, tough on crime ballot. And that's kind of where it all begins, where the whole philosophy of let's punish instead of rehabilitate. And this is rather surprising, in fact, because Nixon apparently only won by 0.8% of the popular vote, if I remember correctly. And it was largely his, tough on crime and scare tactics that succeeded in getting him the election, if slimly.
right, right. Yeah, back to the fear tactics. Earlier, you were talking about Nixon's. You specifically mentioned, this is your brain on drugs, some of the campaign. I wanted to get in a little bit to just some of the arguments used by the drug warriors. Some of the tactics and stances they take. For example, we have the Nancy Reagan, I believe it was, with the Just Say No campaign. We tend to have a zero tolerance attitude in our educational system, and I just think that's an unrealistic message that we're sending to children. Because we're never going to completely eradicate drug usage. I think instead of teaching this unrealistic total abstinence position, we should instead be teaching people to educate themselves about the risks involved in using these drugs and decide whether or not it's worth it to them. Make informed decisions. Don't feed them ridiculous propaganda and expect them just to never touch drugs, because that's unrealistic. Instead, we should be educating them.
Well, it's the same. A very similar argument can be made for abstinence-only education.
Exactly.
So there's this sort of essence or mote of thought in that by lying or hiding or just ignoring something, you'll deal with it that way. And in my mind, that's a very authoritarian thought, that if you can control somebody's perception of something, you can control the person. Fortunately, at least with drugs and abstinence-only education, we see that is not the case. especially with abstinence-only sex education, as well as with the Just Say No campaign, we see that it doesn't work at all. In fact, it produces the opposite effect. And it produces a lot more in abstinence sex education. It produces a lot more STDs and teen pregnancies and general ignorance about sex. So, if something is going to happen anyway, you are far better off, no matter what it is, letting it happen, informing people how it actually happens, if you can, and letting them make up their own mind about it.
Agreed. While we're on the subject of school children, there are a few more points to be made. Uh, I think one of the most important ones is that when you survey and poll children at the high school age, you find that it's generally easier for them to access illegal drugs than it is alcohol. Uh, and I think this is a very important statistic because what it tells us is when you criminalize something, it obviously doesn't get rid of it. Not only that, because you have dealers who are stepping up to meet the demands, they can actually supply it to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. So if you have a 16-year-old high school kid go to a liquor store, he's not going to have any luck. He has to get somebody who is old enough to buy alcohol to get it for him. This is not the case with drug dealers. So this again goes back to when people say, "Oh, think of the children." Well, here we are thinking of the children because if you want to keep drugs out of the hands of your children, when you push the drug selling into the black market, what you have are dealers who don't ask for ID. When was the last time a drug dealer said, "I'm going to need to see some ID, you don't look 18"? No, that's just unheard of. They sell to who wants it. And
Oh,
this,
regarding morality, though, I don't think it's quite fair to characterize drug dealers in general as, these amoral bunch of people.
that's true, yeah,
So a lot of them aren't going to sell to children simply because they have moral issues with it. I mean,
that is true.
most of them are selling to consenting adults. Very few of them ever try to sell to children, and mostly it's going to be kids whose parents have access to drugs who are going to be getting into their parents' stash, which is the same thing with alcohol. And that's why, you have these parties of teenagers getting drunk at somebody's house because they got into the parents' liquor cabinet. Although, by the same coin, useful to mention is that a lot of access to alcohol for teenagers and people underage is actually from adults that they know, like maybe their parents or a friend of the parents, but then they're drinking under supervision, which is very different from, having someone drink in a back alley. And it's actually safer to be drinking with an adult anyway. For example, not that I recommend teenagers or children be drinking. That's generally bad for their development.
Of course.
But it is nevertheless safer.
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree about your earlier point that all drug dealers aren't amoral thugs who will sell to children. That was obviously a bit unfair on my part. But
Well, they certainly try to paint them that way.
yeah, definitely. But I think the point does still stand that a lot of drugs are fairly accessible to underage children. So it's my point there was just that criminalizing it doesn't keep it out of their hands. But I wanted to narrow in a little bit more on a comparison between currently legal drugs and illegal drugs because I think there's more to be said there. One of the main reasons that I favor legalization and regulation of drugs is because we could actually regulate and oversee the quality of drugs. So you wouldn't have things happen like you get a bad batch of heroin that kills everyone who uses it, for example. Just about 4 days ago, I read an article about how there's a bad batch going around, and something like 8 people in a certain community died. This happens all the time. You have tainted drugs. You have inexperienced, irresponsible drug producers who make some mistake, add some adulterants, accidentally fuck up and skip a step and it causes some toxic chemical to arise in the substance. You have things like this happen all the time, and this would be virtually unheard of in a legalized system. The comparison I always make is, when have you ever heard of a bad batch of Jack Daniels killing dozens of people? Whoever goes to the liquor store and says, this 6-pack of beer I'm about to buy just might kill me because there could be some toxic chemicals in it. This is not a concern that people have, because we understand that these are reputable manufacturing companies who, even though the product isn't safe, they're providing us with a consistent product, and we know what to expect when we use it. The same can't be said about black market drugs, because what we have there is drugs of dubious origin and dubious quality being sold by potentially shady characters, and who knows what's going to happen when you smoke it or inject it into your arm. So that is actually one of the primary reasons that I support legalization and regulation, and I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't have any particular problems with the point. It's just as I mentioned before, there currently isn't much regulatory oversight of states that have legalized marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
So there still isn't much, testing of quality of product and things like that. I do not know of any incidences of people being hurt by that yet, of course, because these are businesses and they obviously don't want to get sued out of existence.
Right, right. Yeah, I guess I was talking more about what a legalized system would ideally look like in my view versus what so far it's beginning to look like in those states. I
Well,
guess.
and there's one specific point we haven't addressed at all, and that is the effect it would have on scientific research. In particular, research on LSD, unfortunately, has been almost non-existent, and it's one of the more interesting drugs for its alteration of perception and practically no side effects afterward.
Yeah, there's
And it's
definitely a lot of research to be done. Also with MDMA as well, it's shown promise with post-traumatic stress and certain mental illnesses. So there's definitely
so is
research to be done.
methamphetamine. Yeah, so is methamphetamine.
Methamphetamine, you said?
Methamphetamine can actually be used as a stimulant for people with chronic incurable depression.
Really? Huh.
So if you have treatment-resistant depression, which is actually what I have, what they'll do is, for some of them who have non-addictive personalities, a very small number get actually what amounts to methamphetamine. It's not the same thing you'll get on the street. It's of course going to be in pill form, manufactured by some drug company somewhere. But they essentially give you normally illegal stimulants to a very small selection of people. And it's effective for them. So for some people, you legitimately need an extremely potent stimulant just to stop, say, being depressed. And there's whole research avenues with other drugs that opened with legalization of marijuana, for example, that could potentially be used to treat things like psychiatric illnesses more effectively than standard treatments do today. And the efficacy of standard treatments for mental illnesses are very hit and miss, especially due to the imprecise nature of diagnosis and things like that. But yeah, I did find it interesting once I found that out, that they are actually prescribing very potent stimulants to a subset of people with very severe clinical depression.
Yeah, I had no idea that methamphetamine was on the list. I know there are amphetamines, drugs in that related family that are used, but I didn't know that methamphetamine itself was used. That's news to me.
People have also unofficially used it to treat things like ADHD. And online there are drug websites for drug reviews and such, surprisingly enough. And a lot of people self-report that certain drugs pretty much cure them. Now, of course, these are self-reports, this is online, and it's not at all
Yeah, yeah.
scientific. but people are reporting it, and on that basis alone, it would be interesting for study. But yeah, they apparently are prescribing something like methamphetamine.
Wow. Uh, Now, I want to switch gears a little bit, if we could, and talk a bit about how our policy in the United States affects other countries. Now, one example that comes to mind is how the United States has a sort of certification process with other countries, and if we don't deem other countries as sufficiently uh, energetic in prosecuting drug related crimes, then we can withdraw all non drug related aid. And so this is a way that our government basically coerces other governments to comply with their policy. And unfortunately, in a lot of these countries, in a lot of Central American and South American countries, what you see is these are the countries where some of the drugs, cocaine for example, are produced in massive quantities. And what's ended up happening there is the cartels and the gangs and the criminal organizations have just exploded. They've made a tremendous amount of money. The violence is rampant. We've been having mayors and elected officials getting assassinated, kidnapped, tortured, mutilated. The same goes for news reporters. This has been happening to a lot of news reporters in those countries. Literally tens of thousands of people in those countries have been killed in drug related violence. Oftentimes it's just bystanders, people who just happen to be there when the machine gun fire starts spraying. So our policy has birthed these criminal organizations and is very much responsible for a lot of the death and misery that we see in these countries.
Well, there have also been a lot of there's been a lot of public investigation into the role of the CIA and other government officials in other countries related to things like the drug war. There have also been minor public furors in the past, like in the 80s or 70s, regarding involvement of our government in other governments to the benefit of, say, oil corporations. For some reason, though, these never stay in public memory,
Not
and they're
surprising.
very quickly forgotten. Of course, the media doesn't do much to raise furor about them. I think the general problem with all of this is the way the media handles it, in that it doesn't handle it at all. In fact, the media establishments are very much pro-establishment.
Oh, of course. Another point to mention. This is relevant to Central American and South American countries. This is relevant to the United States, both at the large scale and at the small scale. Uh, Corruption. This is a huge problem with the drug war, because when we have this black market, when these people have millions of dollars, they can spend this money to corrupt people. And you have whole governments in some Central and South American countries, whole police forces that are just corrupted to the core. Uh, you have in the United States, you have police departments, you have uh, there are just all sorts of corruption scandals that always crop up. It's police commissioners, police chiefs. Sometimes it's just small groups of police officers. Sometimes it's not even police related. Sometimes it's, let's say, airline employees, for example. Uh, there are just so many different groups of people who get corrupted by this massive flood of drug money, and this is a big problem, especially in some of those Central and Southern American countries.
People seem to think that these things only happen elsewhere, though, in spite of the fact that the Kids for Cash scandal happened as recently as 2008, and yet a lot of these things that are caught in the US, where there's overt corruption and money being traded in order to get criminal convictions, are entirely ignored. Or if they aren't ignored, they're only remembered for a short amount of time. So you still have that problem in the United States. And the harsher the penalties involved, and the more money is involved, the more likely you are to see that, which is why you see it so much in the countries you mentioned, because the drugs are so valuable and so much money is being made that a corrupt official can make more in one corrupt dealing than they could working their entire lives.
Oh, of course.
And if you have that much money involved, then the person is just going to be asking, well, who's really being hurt by this? And when it comes to the concept of like evil in humans or corruption, it's never a person, it's almost never, unless you have a true psychopath, it's almost never a person who's going to go from a normal, functional, moral human being to, oh, I'm going to kill this person for money. There's always the tons of small intermediary steps. Which is another subject kind of ignored in our criminal prosecution, is that you don't start off being a criminal. You start off doing really minor things that only kind of bend the rules, you get away with it, then you start doing more things because you can get away with it. And this is actually the foundation of some of our more major scandals with pyramid schemes in stock trading. It starts off really small, they realize nobody's paying attention, and then they go, well, you know, I can make a killing doing this, let me keep going.
Right, right. Now there are still a few more points that we could hit on the subject if you don't mind continuing a bit more, because we haven't exactly gotten too in depth about what legalization and regulation would consist of, or if that's even preferable. Because one thing we need to keep in mind is that there are several options on the table. We could stay the course. We could maintain our criminalization stance. We could simply decriminalize these drugs and make their possession, make certain amounts of, make possessing certain amounts in line with the law. That's one option. Or we could outright legalize them and regulate their distribution. Now, those are the different options. What's your view on the best way forward?
Considering the points we've talked about so far, I think outright legalization is the best option. It makes the most pure economic sense, and morally, it seems to make the best sense there as well.
Agreed. With decriminalization, this is a stance that a lot of people I see take. It's sort of a middle of the road position. The problem with decriminalization, in my view, is that it doesn't get rid of a lot of the problems with the black market, because the manufacture and the distribution of drugs is still in the hands of criminal organizations under a system of decriminalization. You're still getting drugs of dubious quality. When you actually legalize and regulate, then these criminal organizations aren't going to have this cash flow. Because the price of drugs in a legalized, regulated system is going to be so much lower, there's just not going to be the incentive to sell these drugs. So these gangs who are dependent upon drug profits, these cartels, these organizations, while they're not necessarily going to be wiped out because they have other sources of income, this source of income will virtually evaporate once these drugs are actually legalized. So that's something I always stress when somebody says maybe we should just decriminalize, because we could decriminalize all drugs and we would still see bloodshed and violence in the streets. We would still see the sort of, the torturings and the kidnappings in other countries. So decriminalization doesn't solve the problem, in my view.
Well, yeah, you see that as well in areas where they don't prosecute prostitutes, for example. The prostitutes still suffer the same problems with abuse from pimps, drug addictions, things like that. Unless you have an actual brothel that's subject to government investigation, the core problems don't go away. And there's another interesting point to make about our effects on other countries, in that due to how expensive the drugs are and how much money is being made, it's having an active economic depressive effect on other countries. Because instead of doing things like focusing on manufacturing or building infrastructure and things like that, why on earth would you work in those fields when you can just sit around growing plants and shipping them off for thousands of dollars at a pop? So our drug war actually has an active depressant effect on countries that are manufacturing these drugs, aside from the establishment of cartels and mass corruption. Just purely economically, they're very underdeveloped and will likely remain so as long as we continue the drug war. Because it
Yeah,
just makes it too valuable.
yeah, you have, for example, farmers in Afghanistan, say, who are growing poppy fields because it's just immensely profitable. You have people in Southern and Central American countries growing coca and producing it just because it's so profitable. And
Instead of food.
exactly. And our government's response has been one of a couple of different options. One is to try to motivate crop substitution, where we pay these people to basically grow other crops, non-drug related crops. What
More
what some
taxpayer dollars down the drain.
exactly what sometimes ends up happening is they take the money and they still grow the poppy or the coca behind the government's back. So I mean, obviously they're going to do this. They're poor farmers. It's just easy money. Another solution by our government, unfortunately, has been just to go into these countries sometimes and just try to either cooperate with those governments and just try to outright eradicate these drugs. And sometimes they'll go in and they'll dump all sorts of herbicides and chemicals on these fields to try to get rid of them. And this can actually have a pretty substantial environmental impact because you have, this is seeping into the groundwater or creeks or it's killing other plants. So it's hard to imagine at the outset how the drug war could be detrimental for the environment, but this is just one of many very real ways where you see that.
And it's not like it improves our international relations any either.
Oh yeah, that's for
I
sure.
do believe we've covered the whole gamut of this subject.
Yeah, you want to move on to AI?
I do believe it's time.
All right, cool. Before we move on now, do you have any educational resources, books, or articles or anything that you'd recommend for our listeners?
Well, if you want to research uh, a survey that's conducted, and it's a very thorough survey, it is just a survey, of course, so there are limitations to it. But behavioral health trends in the United States results from the 2014 National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It is financed by SAMHSA. I cannot pronounce that. But that includes tons of results on specific uses of drugs, who's using them, why they're using them, frequency of use. It also includes tobacco and alcohol use. And it gives a pretty clear picture of who is using the drugs, where they are, and why. And that's probably the best resource you're going to find. Otherwise, the Bureau of Statistics for the federal government is only going to give you statistics on, amounts of people arrested, for what charges, for how long, things like that.
All right, great. I have three books I would recommend for our listeners. The first one would be Why Our Drugs Laws Have Failed and What We Can Do About It, a judicial indictment of the war on drugs. This is written by Judge James P. Gray, and this is a fantastic book. It's the best book I have on the subject. Read it, and read it again. It's extremely thorough and in-depth and packed with statistics and utterly convincing. The next book I would recommend it's called The War on Drugs, A Failed Experiment by Paula Malaya. And the final one is written by Dan Baum, and it's called Smoke and Mirrors, The War on Drugs and the Politics of Failure. And with that, we're now going to shift gears and move on to our next topic, which is artificial intelligence. Now, this is a very big topic. There's a lot to cover here, and I honestly don't even know where to begin. Is there any specific point that you want to start at?
Well, I have a quote we can start at, which might be a little unhelpful at first. But my problem with the field of artificial intelligence research, in terms of actually producing something that mirrors human intelligence, applied AI or weak AI, AI that only focuses on specific tasks, very useful. Tons of things have come out of it. But when you're trying to produce an actual conscious entity, there's one primary problem there. And it's described quite aptly in a collection of definitions of intelligence by Shane Legg and Marcus Hutter. This is a research article posted in 2006. It starts off with a very useful quote here. Viewed narrowly, there seem to be almost as many definitions of intelligence as there were experts asked to define it. So, when you're talking about artificial intelligence, and if you are trying to research ways to, say, produce consciousness or produce an actual intelligence versus just applied AI, which is what most researchers are actually doing, how do you define intelligence?
It's a good question. Not one that I'm sure I have an answer to. Do you think in principle though that it is possible for conscious robots, machines, computers, whatever you call them, conscious software? Do you think it's possible that something like that could ever come about?
Well, I have a question to that needs answering first.
Okay,
That is, how do you define consciousness?
that's a tough one. Uh, how do we define consciousness?
There are whole fields of
Yeah,
epistemology and philosophy that have gone over this for literally thousands of years.
I don't know. I guess the best working definition I can think of is having some experience, having perceiving things, having thoughts. Uh, I don't know. That's tough. What
Oh,
do you have a
well,
definition to work with?
well, I was going to say you're hitting very close to one of the more common definitions of consciousness, which is the qualia or sentience, the conscious experience of having experience. That's you hit very close to that one. My definition of it is a little bit more rooted in the physical mechanistic processes of our brains. Now, I am not an absolute physicalist. I'm not what's called an eliminative materialist. And I'm throwing around some philosophy buzzwords here. I
Yes,
apologize for that.
it's quite all right.
But an eliminative materialist would basically argue that it reduces everything to materialism, is what they do. So, states of mind, consciousness, all of these nebulous concepts essentially are illusory to the eliminative materialist. So, you have that sort of region of philosophers. My definition of consciousness would be something more along the lines that it's an abstraction of our mechanistic processes. So you have mechanistic processes, you have parts of the brain dedicated to specific tasks. But in working in concert, they abstractly produce a sort of metacognition, you might say. So when you get multiple processes working together, collectively they do something different than individually. And you'll find that all the time with very complicated machinery, too. It's also the question of interpreting things like art, for example. Do you take it piece by piece? Do you take the details, or do you take the whole? So I would argue consciousness can be defined as the whole of our individual processes. So I would say it's an abstract concept. You're not actually going to find it physically in the brain. You can certainly find individual functions and processes, but you're not going to find consciousness itself. And that's what I've gotten so far in terms of trying to define it.
Okay. So do you think there could be a similar process of individual elements coming together to form some larger cognitive experience for machines or software?
Well, that kind of is the direction that AI researchers have been moving into beyond simply deep learning, is they've been utilizing simulations of neural networks and things like that to try and do so. But it's a question still, even if you have a machine capable of doing some amount of self-learning, there is still no clear line in the sand of, this is not conscious, this is conscious. And there's a long history of people attempting to define what that line in the sand is. Of course, the most well-known one is Alan Turing
Yes.
and his Turing test. And of course, the problem with that is that relies more on the intelligence of the participant and their ability to discern artificial behavior from real behavior. So it relies more on a social ability than it does a recognition of consciousness. Relying on other humans to recognize consciousness is a very bad idea because humans are very biased on average, and most of them don't usually think about these things to begin with.
Yeah, I personally view the Turing test as one of the worst ideas that's been relatively widely accepted. I think it's frankly a terrible test for what it claims to be looking for. For those who don't know, I'll just briefly describe the Turing test, and you can correct me if I make a mistake here. The Turing test basically consists of having a human being interact with a machine or some sort of artificial intelligence, and if that human is fooled, and if that human thinks that they're in an exchange with a human being as opposed to a machine or a program or software, then that machine, I'm just going to use machine as my default term from now on, then that machine is said to pass the Turing test. Now, the Turing test is thought to be, in some circles, an indicator that the machine is a thinking thing, that the machine is conscious. Some think that if a machine passes the Turing test, then it is therefore a thinking, conscious thing. And that specifically is what I think is a ridiculous idea, because all you have is programming that a person has been fooled into thinking is conscious. It's not necessarily a thinking thing just because it passed the test. There's actually another famous philosopher who had a rebuttal. He had a thought experiment that I think pretty conclusively refutes the idea that the Turing test demonstrates consciousness. And that was the philosopher John Searle. He came up with this thought experiment called the Chinese room, where there's this big box and a person feeds in a piece of paper with a sentence written in Chinese, and then there's an output that spits out a response. Now, there's a man inside this box. He doesn't speak a word of Chinese. He knows absolutely nothing about what these characters mean on the page. All he has is a code book where he finds the symbols in his code book, and it shows him the output that he's supposed to produce. So this person doesn't understand Chinese. It doesn't speak Chinese, but the box itself is producing the illusion that the person speaks Chinese. And the point of this example is obviously to demonstrate that just because something is generating output and fools somebody into thinking that they're in an exchange with somebody who has a certain capability, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person or that thing actually does have that characteristic. Is that? Would you say that's an accurate description of those two ideas?
I think that is a perfectly good basic explanation of where things are. Um, it does bring to my mind, though, kind of an appeal to a homunculus argument. And what a homunculus was originally in early philosophy of mind was this idea that there was a little man inside your head, and he would be doing things like, processing your visual perceptions, for example. And of course, then the argument is, well, who's controlling that homunculus? Who's controlling that little man? Is there another little man inside of him? And then it's turtles all the way down.
Yeah.
But the Chinese room thought experiment brings to mind the homunculus problem. Because you can apply the Chinese room argument to our brains as well. Is that how do you... It clearly explains what isn't comprehension, what isn't actual intelligence or consciousness. Is that just mechanistically doing a process is not consciousness. Sure. It does that perfectly fine. What it does not do is move us in a direction of what is conscious then. Because an argument can be made mechanistically, physically, that our brains neurologically are essentially doing just that on a much more complicated scale.
Okay. I mean, we could just outright set aside the Chinese room experiment, and we can just ask ourselves: is the Turing test, does it reliably demonstrate consciousness? Or I guess to phrase the question in a better way, is the passage of the Turing test a necessary indicator of consciousness? If something passes the Turing test, is it necessarily a thinking, conscious entity? And I think the answer is obviously no. I mean, you could just have a very simple program where input is received, output is produced.
To be fair, it's not going to be a simple program if it does manage to pass the Turing test.
You think so? Okay. Well, let's say a complicated program. Complicated. Let's revise that.
Let's not sell the AR researchers short. They'll hang us for it.
Yeah,
and justifiably so.
You got me there. Okay. But yeah, let's say you have a program where input is received, output is produced, and it could be audio output, and it could correlate with facial muscle changes and emotional expressions and so forth. This wouldn't necessarily mean that that this machine that passed the test is a thinking thing. An example that just came to mind that I'm just going to go with on the fly is video games. You have certain video games where you can interact with other in-game computer characters, and you can have a conversation with them, and you can choose different conversational options, and they appear to be having a conversation with you, and they laugh, and they get angry at you or something. This computer program isn't feeling those emotions. It's not experiencing any conscious processes. It's just a program. So I don't know. That's just an example that I came up with on the fly. But I think the Turing test doesn't necessarily demonstrate consciousness. That's the point that I'm really trying to hammer in here.
Okay, two things here. Part of what this is getting at is the qualia term in philosophy. And as you mentioned, just because something expresses what we normally recognize as an emotion doesn't mean it's actually experiencing that emotion. So the whole trying to produce a conscious AI necessarily requires that it experiences what it feels or what it thinks. And if it doesn't do that, that's when we get into the concept of a philosophical zombie. And a philosophical zombie is kind of exactly what the Chinese room thought experiment describes.
Right.
You would have a human being who expresses all the outward signs of consciousness, but does not actually possess consciousness. And if you are outside the Chinese room, and you're reading the Chinese characters, and you speak Chinese, of course, would you be able to say that person doesn't speak Chinese?
No, obviously.
Yeah, so there's no way of knowing. And the other problem with the Turing test besides that is that it's not scientific at all. There's no actual empirical part of that test. So currently, as far as I'm aware, we do not have an empirical way to define consciousness, and we don't have an empirical way to test for it.
That was going to be my next question. I was going to ask, would there be any way to determine whether a machine that appears conscious actually is conscious. And as you just alluded to, we currently don't have a method to determine this. So apparently we I mean, it would be hard to be certain, even if you had a machine that was laughing and pleading not to unplug me, and it was experiencing a whole range of emotions that we know. How would we know for certain that this thing is actually conscious? How would we know that it's having an experience? How would we know that this is not just the result of clever programming? It would be very difficult to determine, not even with certainty, but just to be reasonably justified in believing that this machine is conscious. It's just a very difficult question to answer.
Hmm. Well, this all does bring back to the fore the problem of qualia, the experiencing effect that various philosophers argue exist with philosophy of mind. That your mind experiences experience. And some of the arguments made in the field of AI research, especially from some academics I've been reading, is that you are essentially not going to get something resembling human consciousness until you perfectly mirror all of our sensory inputs and you perfectly mirror all of our physical, biological circumstances. And at least on a physical level, well, you're basically constructing a human artificially, so that would make perfect sense. If you can do that, then you probably would end up with a conscious entity. But as for trying to do it some other way, I'm not quite sure that is possible. On the other hand, if you subscribe to the, what is it I mentioned before? If you are a subscriber to eliminative materialism, then you're probably going to say, as long as you have all the functions of a human being, you're going to have consciousness. As long as you have all the functions, the physical characteristics of consciousness, then you're going to have consciousness. And of course, well, they would be saying that consciousness is not a legitimate term to use anyway, that it's illusory. But that also opens up a whole other can of worms of, if there is no consciousness, if that's all illusory, if there is no states of mind, if because of the introspective bias that humans experience, taking that as a whole, then how on earth would you consider something to be animate or inanimate? Or how would you get to a point where you could say, this is a thinking thing? And you're kind of stuck in this frame of mind if you're going into this philosophical bucket, because you don't really have any dog in this fight. You're going to be producing all of the functions of the human brain without any real way to say when it's enough, or when it's actually a thinking thing.
I don't know. Well, I'm not an AI researcher. I'm not obviously well versed in this field, but I tend to take a pretty open-minded view towards this, and my viewpoint is, if atoms and molecules can be arranged in a certain way within our brains to produce consciousness, then I see no reason in principle why a different arrangement of different materials couldn't produce the same or a similar experience. Not necessarily the same, but a similar experience. I don't see any reason why why that necessarily would not be allowed by different materials.
Well, the question then is, can you produce the same experience through a different means? So can you get a sufficient analogy with hardware? Can you get a sufficient analogy to biological experience with synthetic reproduction?
Why couldn't we? Is there any reason in principle why we should dismiss the possibility?
Well, we don't quite know all that much about ourselves to begin with.
That's true.
But I would say that if you are trying to produce something analogous to the human experience, the amount of processing you would need to do just to simulate even a little bit of that in those circumstances is so enormous and would require so much power and so much computing time that if you could do it, it would probably only simulate something for a couple of seconds, and then you would have terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes of data and have fun sifting through that.
Well, to be fair, that's just with our current level of technology. As we know, technology is steadily increasing. Our computing power is steadily
Which
increasing.
does not imply it's going to be able to get to a point where you can legitimately do that, though. This is one of
I think given
those.
enough time, I think it would be inevitable. That's what I would argue.
But why is it inevitable?
If our computing power is just steadily increasing, eventually we'll reach a point where we can do those sort of computations.
Well, that's a pretty big if, is my point here. What about our past trends in advances in computing imply that future trends in advances in computing will lead to something different? This is one of those problems of induction.
Yeah,
You
I see.
can't you can't project the future from the past, not reliably. You can only make an argument of probability there, and we can't really make an argument of probability here because we have absolutely no idea what future technology is going to be like or its limitations.
Okay, let's be a little looser then, and let's say if the trend continues, which, as you said, it's a big if, but if the trend continues, then eventually we should reach a point where we have that sort of computing power.
Well, if you can simulate every single function of the human brain, then functionally you would have a simulation that reproduces all of its functions. The question then becomes, is it the man painting the Chinese characters at that point still, or is it actually going to have what we might call consciousness? So is it actually going to have an experience of experiencing, or is it simply going to be a run-through of functions? So is it going to have that abstract collaboration of those functions, or is it just going to have them producing things or sensing things? So the real problem here is, how do you get something to think about thinking, or how do you get something to think in general? And doing that computationally, yeah, I'm also not an AI researcher. I've tried to read up on it quite extensively, and I haven't really seen any answers to this because it's just so far off. So mostly you're getting people doing research in big data, neural networks, a lot of applied AI. Most of the research done for strong AI, which is that sort of conscious reproduction we were talking about, most of that is very speculative, and a lot of it also is pretty much philosophy, because you need to start from a certain number of assumptions or axioms about what defines consciousness or intelligence or experience or qualia, or whether or not those exist, in order to actually go somewhere with it. So you need to start off with an idea, or you're not going to get anywhere. So a lot of these are very speculative.
One interesting idea that I came across last night as I was watching some lecture. I can't remember the guy's name. It was, I think, I want to say something Dewey, maybe Daniel Dewey. I can't quite remember his name. He's an AI researcher, and he presented this very interesting idea of allowing artificial intelligence, allowing machines, software, what have you, to research itself, better design itself, better manufacture its own components, and then allow the next iteration to do the same thing. And you just allow this process to cycle through, thousands of times. And since this machine is going to be working dramatically faster than human researchers could do, this has the potential, he argued, to produce what he called an intelligence explosion, where since this AI is working so fast on itself and it's improving itself and its own software, he argued that this could have the possibility to exponentially grow and eventually potentially give birth to a conscious machine, which I thought was a very interesting idea. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're doing something similar to that with medical applications currently. And you'll have circumstances where machines can actually diagnose people better than doctors can. So, if we argue that intelligence is something that's applied, for example, then in that case, machines or applied AI like that are definitely way more intelligent than a human could ever hope to be. But it still comes back to this problem of how you define consciousness, just like it always comes back to the problem of how do you define intelligence. And most people are kind of banking on neurology to discover the answer to this. But of course, if you don't find, this part of the brain is exactly where consciousness lies, if we don't discover that, then we still have the same problem. And it's exactly the question of, is a person with no capacity for memory still conscious? And in part, no. If you don't have any memory, you can't reflect. And with no reflection comes no experience. Or the same experience over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, you mentioned medical research, and I think it'd be worthwhile just to expand a bit on some of the potential applications of AI technology. While this wouldn't necessarily be, conscious machines doing the legwork here, these would still be advanced machines and computers doing some of these things. Some of the ideas and proposals that I came across were shocking to me. There was this one researcher, I can't recall his name, but he suggested that machines working on curing all sorts of diseases within the next century, we should have most of our diseases cured, because AI working on this would just work so much faster than us. It would be able to propose hypotheses and conduct experiments and perform billions of simulations on the human body with one drug and another drug and another drug. And his suggestion was, if we allow this sort of AI technology to try and cure diseases for us, then we could see them virtually wiped out in a matter of decades. Uh, I thought that was just a pretty incredible suggestion, and I've really never heard anything like that before.
Well, this is one of the many applications of applied or weak AI. So these are the main advances in AI research as far as I've managed to come across. And as I mentioned before, all of the research into strong AI tends to be much more speculative and has the problem of, well, what set of definitions are you using? But applied AI and the techniques for enhancing applied AI are very impressive. Like, again, using the computers are diagnosing people better than doctors do.
Right.
Or at least using the computer search as a reference. I mean, doctors currently are using computers, essentially like WebMD, to get suggestions on diagnoses. They plug in the symptoms, and the computer will bring up a list of suggestions, and then the doctor will combine that with his education and experience to make a more accurate diagnosis. Which, of course, at first inherently relies on the doctor accurately recording symptoms. If you tell a doctor something, and he doesn't believe you, and he doesn't put it down as a symptom, you get a wrong diagnosis. Which is one example of many myriads of ways in which, personal human failings can result in, even with good AI, insufficient results. So, in a sense, no matter how good applied AI gets, there's always going to be the problem of the error between keyboard and screen.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So yeah, it doesn't at all resolve our personal failings. It's just another example of us using more and more advanced tools to achieve better results. It doesn't improve us directly in any way, though. Unless, of course, you produce some nootropic drug which manages to make us vastly more intelligent, which has been the subject of a couple of movies and more than a number of science fiction books.
So, what do you think about the prospects of humans not just working together with AI in the future, but what do you think about the prospects of humans actually merging with machines?
Ah, yes, the transhumanism.
Yes, you knew it would get here.
Well, it still comes back to the heart of the problem of if you don't know what you're messing with to begin with, might not be the best idea to jump on that boat. Might not be the best idea to jump on what might be the Titanic. Of course, this is just what's known as an appeal to fear, I suppose.
Sure.
But I am trying to word it in such a way that it's much more a caution. Because if you don't know what you're dealing with, you don't know the results of it, and it's going to get a lot more murky because if we don't know what we're dealing with to begin with, when we start doing this and we start upgrading or enhancing ourselves, and that goes on for a while and we still don't know, where's the line of consciousness or does or doesn't it exist, and then imagine one day that we actually do find out what it is. And then all those people who enhance themselves, let's say they had neural enhancements. Well, maybe the definition we find that actually does exist, maybe for them it no longer exists. Or maybe it produces some bad effects on human society. It's not something I would suggest people leap on.
So if we had some sort of, let's say within the next couple decades, uh, some sort of groundbreaking technology was announced where you could enhance your memory by 200%. You could live 50 years longer with certain implants. Are you saying that you would avoid those because of your cautionary approach?
Well, for purely mechanistic enhancements, most of us have those already in the form of artificial hips, knees, bone replacements. A lot of these simple mechanistic things we already have. We have artificial hearts, and those do not seem to generally produce much of a difference at all, except for where they're inadequate. Like reduced blood pressure, you can't move around that much, you can't really exercise that much, things like that. So there's an inhibitory effect. Focusing specifically on the enhancement effect technology might have, like with increasing memory and so forth. Interesting thing here to note is that people with depression tend to have better long-term memories. And that is in part reinforced by the depression because it sort of solidifies your neural anatomy. So you have reduced neuroplasticity as well, the more severe your depression, which has an enhancing effect on long-term memory. And so if you do that mechanically, there's no way to know whether or not you may end up suffering from different psychological disorders as a result. So
So
there's not really enough research going on in there. Not
so
yet.
so in short, no would be your answer to that sort of those sort of enhancements.
I am never the one to be the first.
What was that?
I'm never the one to be the first to do something. I would much rather observe people who want to take that risk.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd be as cautious as you. If companies or researchers were coming forth and saying you can dramatically enhance your memory and you can live for 100 years longer if you get these nanobots inside your bloodstream or if you get this chip implanted or what have you, I would very strongly consider it. Uh, I don't think I would be as cautious as you are. Wise as that may be.
Well, I advocate for caution as well. Okay, so with the things I mentioned already so far, like with the relationship of memory and depression, these also affect individuals differently. So even if you had somebody who's more or less exactly like you in a lot of ways. Let's say you have two people with depression. Using the example of medications, you give those two people the same medication with the exact same symptoms, one of them will be perfectly fine and the other one commits suicide. Same socioeconomic conditions, same symptoms, same experiences in therapy, same everything. They can even be twins, and one of them commits suicide. We still can't figure out why that is. And there's plenty of good research conducted on twins with psychological disorders where one is fine and one isn't. There's as much research as we can possibly get away with on that currently, and I'm very interested in that field. But there are still no definitive results from it, and that's even with twins. So in the case of using technology to modify ourselves, especially cognitively or neurologically, there's no way to know from one individual to the next whether or not, it may cause one individual to have a horrible psychological disorder, or another individual to commit suicide, or one to become psychopathic, or a whole host of other problems.
Sure. Well, to be fair, obviously, before these things were going to be announced and mass produced to the public, obviously there would be an extensive period of testing, and they would not just unveil something like this and then
Well,
just
and they
foist it on the consumer market without first ensuring that we wouldn't have these sort of side effects.
Well, keep in mind that all of the drugs we use have passed FDA testing. And people who are prescribed these drugs that pass FDA testing still commit suicide. So, using that as an example, it's a question of, is it worth the risk? And additionally, once these technologies become to be adopted, and certain individuals do use them, and let's say it goes well for those individuals, well, they have a huge advantage over everyone who's not modified. And in a society like ours, in capitalism like ours, then businesses would be far more likely to hire someone who is modified over someone who is not. So that's a huge pressure on, well, if I am going to get this job or this scholarship or succeed in this field, well, then I need that modification too.
Yeah, I guess I never thought through the societal implications, potential employment opportunities, and things like that. I've never thought that in depth about it. Yeah, there would definitely be some ramifications of that sort.
And this is something that's been discussed a lot in terms of genetic modifications. There's a movie called Gattaca.
Yes, I've seen it.
Yeah, so you know exactly what that implies genetically of, well, okay, you have this genetically modified group of people who are high in intelligence and are the best possible. They're not even really modified. They just pick the best sperm and the best egg and put them together. And you get these high IQ people who are all beautiful and who are all very intelligent, and they pretty much run society. And everyone who is a chancer, an up to God born baby with no selection at all, are stuck mopping floors, no matter how intelligent they actually are, just on the basis of their being not selected. So you'd end up with the same scenario with enhancements in technology. You either accept the enhancement and become enhanced, or you're stuck mopping floors.
Right, right.
So I think functionally, there are some very severe societal concerns to be had when it comes to these types of technological enhancements, and they still apply to genetic engineering as well.
Yeah, those are very good points. Um, if we could, I wanted to turn to a different part of this conversation. This is going to be a bit more unrealistic, but I was hoping that we could grant a very generous assumption just for the sake of discussion. Now, let's imagine that we do end up in a situation, let's say 50 years from now, where conscious machines that are demonstrably conscious, that we know actually are conscious, let's imagine that such a scenario arises within 50 years. What do you think it's a very generous assumption, I know, but what do you think some of the potential consequences of that would be? How would that affect society? Could we see the robots try to take over, like you see in the movies, like you see in Terminator or iRobot? Or is that just fear mongering? And do you think we could place safeguards that would prevent the machine from violating certain programmed protocols? Could we contain the machine? Could we isolate it from the internet? Do you think that there's any risk involved in such a situation, or do you think that's just fear mongering?
Well, this gets into the long-standing Isaac Asimov interpretation of robotics, where you have, these standard three laws of robotics. And in terms of trying to control another conscious entity, I mean, we already have laws for that. But if you're placing inherent limitations on what a conscious being can do by design, you are essentially imprisoning them or holding them to... No, yeah, essentially imprisoning them for the entirety of their existence, so that they cannot make these decisions to do these things. And the moral question there is that acceptable to do? And if it's acceptable to do to a robot, why not also a human? So once you start asking these questions and exploring these topics, the differentiation between robot and human kind of disappear entirely, because what standard you apply to the robot applies also to the human being if they are both conscious.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I agree with you. But just to play devil's advocate, what would you make of the argument that because we designed them and created them, because we're responsible for this, that we have some sort of authority is given us to treat them as we like? What would you think of that sort of argument?
I would think of it the same as I think of a monarchy. Just because you have a position of authority does not mean you have some innate or inherent right to exercise it, or to maintain it. Just because you're born of a certain family doesn't mean you're born into special privileges. So, the question then becomes, if, let's say, if there is a God, for example, the same arguments apply there as would apply to a robot.
Right.
If God is evil, why should we worship him? The robot's going to think, well, these humans are pretty fucked up, thinking that they own me. And one of the hallmarks of consciousness is a strain of individualism.
Yes.
So you're going to get a very pissed off robot who does not appreciate humans in the slightest for their arrogant presumption that he is a piece of property when he is a thinking thing.
Yeah, I like the route this is going. Before we jump off and go down that road, let me just jump back real quick and sort of answer my own question. My response to that devil's advocate question of I made you so I can break you, I can treat you as I like. My response would be, just imagine by analogy a parent saying something about their child. Oh, me and your mother made you, so we can torture you and destroy you and enslave
Which
you.
happens, well, not to that extreme, but oftentimes parents might just say something because I'm the parent, that's why.
That is true.
And you know
Yeah.
exactly how well that doesn't work.
Yeah, I think it's a poor justification to give to their children.
It's
Uh,
not justification. And then you have the other argument of, well, okay, what about slaves then? You have purchased a slave, you own it. Is it still morally right to own a slave?
so
And
would you I assume that you would then view such robotic labor as analogous to slavery. Is that correct?
they are thinking things. And I would apply the exact same morality to an alien species as well. If something is a thinking thing, it is no different from other thinking things. There may be degrees to which it is capable of thought, but those variances of degrees does not entitle one to amoral treatment toward it. I mean, we don't amorally treat people with retardation or Down syndrome or autism or any number of other severe neurological or congenital problems We don't maltreat them, and they are much less capable than us. In fact, we give them special treatment most times than not, just so they can function in society. We allow them to function in society. And to suggest that you treat some other conscious thinking thing differently, just because it looks different than you or is based on a different concept than you, is fundamentally immoral.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I would imagine that in such a scenario, we would have to greatly restructure society. We would have to pass all sorts of legislation. We would have to amend our constitution and so forth, and set up all sorts of rules and restrictions on how we can treat these conscious machines. What sort of practices are allowable? What things are prohibited? All sorts of interesting questions come up. Would they be given the right to vote? Would they have a say in how society is run? How what sort of rules would we put in place? You know, if a human uh, unplugs or destroys a machine, is that murder? If a machine kills a person, is that murder? Or as the CEO of that major company in iRobot suggested, would that be more in the realm of an industrial accident? So once you start to go down this road, you see just how complex it is, and you see that we would have to completely restructure society to make room for these conscious machines.
We would have to do the same if we discover conscious aliens. So it's not necessarily a robot problem.
Well, let me just say real quick. Let me just jump in real quick and say, to be fair, with conscious aliens, they wouldn't necessarily be forced to live amongst us like these robots would, because presumably they would have their own planet or something. But that's a small point. Go on though.
Well, I mean, with robots, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would choose to live among us, nor that we could force them to if we wanted to. But a lot of depictions of robots paints them exactly like human beings, which carries with it a significant degree of irrationality. I mean, you have the Matrix movie, you have Terminator, and so forth, and really the amount of effort expended by the robots in all of these scenarios is absolutely ludicrous, to the point where it would have made far more sense simply to leave. Go colonize Mars. You don't need air. Mars has plenty of raw materials.
That's a good
You
point.
can survive in the vacuum of space relatively well, depending on radiation shielding. You are far more durable as a machine than most humans are to endure extreme situations if you are built for it.
That's a very good point. Do you think there would be some element of spite and resentment though? Because I cut the conversation off earlier when it was just getting down a really interesting path. Earlier you were describing how these machines would they would have a sense of individuality, and if they were being forced to work for us, even though they're dramatically smarter than us, or if even they were equal to us, they would see us as arrogant and so forth. So maybe that would serve as the fuel for these sort of things that we see in movies, where you see a robot takeover, an extermination program, kill all humans sort of thing. So maybe that wouldn't be too far off the mark just because of the way that we would treat them.
Well, and there's philosophical answers to this, because even if you don't have a sense of empathy, for example, there are plenty of psychopaths who don't go around killing or particularly hurting people. They may make them unpleasant on purpose just to get some shits and giggles, but trolls do that online all the time. Nevertheless, yeah, rational self-interest, or enlightened self-interest as it's typically called, what would be most beneficial for that robot's self-interest? And we are assuming this robot can actually think through these things. So he's going to be pondering questions like, what would benefit me as an individual in this scenario? Problem being is that it's a synthetic machine. It can also, if it's capable of calculating things as quickly as a computer, vastly outpace us in constructing things like scenarios
Yeah,
to go through. So that's rather terrifying, because we don't know if the best scenario in a given situation is to actually kill somebody. So there are probably plenty of scenarios whereby our sloppy misbehavior, we might do something good in the short term or the long term. And just because a robot may be significantly more intelligent than us, or able to process things quicker, doesn't mean it's going to be able to predict the future. So they might be subject to the same list of cognitive biases that a human being is. Even if you remove or just ignore the emotion element to things, if you ignore empathy and everything, there's still the problem of induction to consider. So a robot will only be able to produce so many calculations on plausibility.
And what do you think the potential ramifications of that might be?
I think a robot, a conscious robot, even if it is significantly more intelligent, will be fully capable of making mistakes. But there's another problem here with the capacity of robots to develop. If they are a thinking thing, your capacity for thought, and what we find with a lot of people with very high IQs, is if they are stuck in an unstimulating environment, if they are not challenged intellectually, they don't really develop. There's a strain of mediocrity, actually, among people with very high IQs. You'll find them in working as postal workers or warehouse workers. So never really going on to challenge or develop their intelligence much at all. And, of course, they don't have to, because they can work just fine in a given menial task, probably much better than any of their peers. Doesn't necessarily mean that they desire anything more. So a robot, as a thinking thing, may be the exact same way. So it'll be a case of mediocrity instead of exceptional, giftedness. So we may be trying to push an individual to do amazing feats of cognition where they just don't see the point.
I think one of the things that I find most fascinating about this topic of conversation is just how extreme, just how at the different ends of the spectrum the possibilities are. Because as we were talking about earlier, on the one hand, we were talking about AI developments allowing us to cure disease, and it could help us make scientific discoveries. It could help us restructure society. It could help us develop all sorts of efficient, safer technology. It could merge with humans and help us live longer and so forth. At the one end, you have a virtual utopia, but then at the other end, we have potential chaos. We have potential apocalypse. We have potential robotic insurrection and takeover and extermination. So I just think it's fascinating how with this one field of research and technology, the potential is really endless, and it's hard to say which direction we're going to head into, which is pretty terrifying if you ask me.
Well, it certainly doesn't help that the people making these decisions are going to be politicians instead of philosophers. Not that philosophers necessarily are ever going to agree on anything. They don't have to, though. A politician, though, just has to have a plan and convince people of it. So all of this is really going to be more modeled by the general human experience that we see day to day, even now. We are still in a very early stage of our cognitive evolution. And even if we did become more complex over time, cognitively, doesn't necessarily mean that's going to get any better. It might just mean that we get really, really good at being very, very stupid. And related to that, there's another field of research that's rather recent, which is sort of just like how we study IQ. There's a wisdom quotient that's currently being.
There's a what? Sorry.
There's an analogy to IQ that's rather new in research. It's like a wisdom quotient.
Oh, wisdom quotient. Okay.
Yes. Now, of course, there's a lot of BS if you try to Google this. Um, I'm trying to find the author, and I forgot to look him up beforehand. But essentially, wisdom in this field of research is being considered as your ability for self-reflection. And some of the researchers are describing it as a humility that goes with intelligence. A lot of people with high IQs score really low on their testing of self-reflection, because a lot of people with high IQs are actually more prone to certain cognitive biases. They are more prone to the gambler's fallacy. They are more prone to a sense of hyper-agency. They are more prone to the introspective illusion. So, on a human model, having greater intelligence does not make you better capable of self-reflection, which is where this definition of wisdom and this new field of research is going. It's like, okay, so IQ does not tell the whole story. What we are going to do is then start measuring one's ability for self-reflection, and accurate self-reflection at that.
So how do you tie this back to the issue of artificial intelligence?
Well, the question becomes of just because it can process things very quickly doesn't mean it's going to be able to self-reflect very well. And we see this with people with high IQs. Maybe it's going to have an overinflated sense of self-agency. So maybe it's going to think it can, predict and control things far better than it can. If it's an individual, it's still stuck in the same experience other humans have as individuals, where you don't know everything, you can't know everything, all you know is your perceptions. And you can make educated guesses or inductive arguments based on that sense data, on that perception, but it's only one data set.
I think that's actually a very important point to make on this topic, because whenever we tend to imagine these sorts of conscious, hyper advanced machines, the image that tends to come to mind I mean, since it's a computer that's rapidly thinking and making calculations thousands of times faster than we think, we tend to virtually view it as infallible. But as you pointed out, just because it's extremely intelligent and thinks quicker than us doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be infallible. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to make the right decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean that it can predict the future and decide on what the best outcome is. So it still could make mistakes. And I think that is a very important point to make.
Yeah, and a thing to mention here, so I think I found the researcher, and it's one of them is Ursula M. Strodinger. And when they're doing these research papers, they of course define what they're looking for when they're looking at wisdom. And they use a paradigm in this for about 5 criteria, such as self-knowledge and tolerance for ambiguity. And main findings they also test for self-reflection. Main findings for this does show that there's a usefulness for wisdom testing because it has certain predictors of behavior that IQ does not. And specifically, with your resistance to falling prey to things like, say, the gambler's fallacy, or falling prey to hyperagency and all of these other problems. Now, you feed another thinking thing this information, and the question is, well, what are they going to do with it? So is an AI going to, for example, maybe develop an ego? Are they going to start rejecting things because that's implausible, that's never going to happen to me, I'm not like this at all?
Or let's even take it a step further. What if there was a psychopathic AI? What if there was a sadistic AI that enjoyed suffering? I don't see any reason in principle why we should necessarily rule that out.
Well, and then it goes into the question of, well, is an AI going to have emotion? And if they don't, are they really going to do anything? Are they going to do things just because they're doing something? Or are they going to do nothing? Because if you get somebody, like a human for example, with actual, like, pure flat affect, most of these people are so clinically depressed that they don't do a damn thing. And they literally can't get up. And then you have people that with catatonia. So we might end up in this funny scenario where if we do construct an AI and it is a conscious thinking thing, it'll just do nothing. It'll reach a point where it self-actualizes as a thinking thing, and it has no reason to do anything.
Let's take that even a step further. I was actually last night I was reading this book called Terminator and Philosophy. I'll be back, therefore I am. And one of the authors in here, he actually suggested that maybe a conscious machine would actually commit suicide. He said maybe it would pull its own plug. I just thought that was a fascinating proposition. It's just weird to imagine these hyper advanced robots having these sort of cognitive defects or being depressed or
Well,
psychopathic or committing suicide. But I don't see why we should rule it out in principle.
in a word, is it a defect? Because if you think about it, for most human beings, the only reason they continue to exist is because there is a biological demand that they continue to exist. And this causes quite a bit of misery. So there's a little vague question there of, well, how horrible does life have to be before you are justified in offing yourself? And if an AI doesn't have an incentive to continue existing, and there's no reason for us to suppose that consciousness itself would desire self-perpetuation. It's not like the AI has a desire to breed. And we have millions of years of evolution, billions maybe, forcing us to continue breeding because all the ones who didn't stopped existing. The only ones who are still here are the ones who were impelled to perpetuate. So, you might get an AI that's just like, yeah, I think therefore I am, and I quit.
Yeah. it's
Well, again, the question here, and it's a very difficult question, why would an AI keep existing? What about it would make it want to keep existing? It has no innate drive to continue to do so.
so you don't think the fact that it's self-aware would mean that it would desire to continue existing? You don't think there's anything intrinsic to self-awareness, regardless of reproduction and Darwinian biological urges to reproduce and survive? Setting all that aside, you don't think there's anything intrinsic just to the fact that you're a conscious thinking thing that would motivate you to want to continue existing?
Well, there's a lot of biology tied up in trying to convince us as human beings that life is just so damn interesting and worth perpetuating. Now, little aside here, I am actually a philosophical pessimist, so I generally expect the worst to be more likely in a given scenario where it's rational to do so. And in this scenario, it makes a lot more sense to suppose that without any biological mechanism or any mechanism to make existence pleasing by default, there's no reason to actually exist because you get nothing out of it. You get absolutely nothing to impel you to keep existing. Therefore, why do it? On the other hand, you get nothing compelling you not to exist, but actually existing takes work.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Well, are there any other points you'd like to make on this topic?
I do believe I covered them all within the best of my current ability.
All right. I guess there's one uh, final point I would make on the subject, and that's regardless of what the outcome is, regardless of what happens with AI, we are heading in that direction. There's going to be very little stopping it because there's so much profit incentive to develop these sort of things because, like we talked about earlier, there are just so many potential applications that could save lives, save money, etc. So we're heading in this direction. Whether or not we're going to develop conscious machines is an open question. But I would urge people to exercise caution in this field, and those would be my final words on the subject. Be cautious because, as Elon Musk said, we might be summoning the demon. Uh, on that note, do you have any educational resources that you would recommend people check out on the subject?
Well, unfortunately, no, not particularly. They may find use out of looking up and perusing current research on wisdom and trying to use something like a wisdom quotient to gauge people's capacity for self-reflection and ability to deal with doubt. Because apparently wisdom matters far more in your ability to deal with ambiguity than IQ does. And that particular part I find very interesting, because philosophers deal with ambiguity all the time.
I don't really have a lot myself. I would recommend watching some YouTube lectures and debates on the subject because there are quite a few. There are a lot of TED Talks and some debates you can come across.
I would actually not recommend watching TED Talks anymore.
Really? Why is that?
TED has just gotten awful.
You think
I
so?
mean, well, it stopped being about the forefront of research and interesting ideas quite a while ago.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of shit on there, I'll be honest. Okay, well, the setting TED aside, the only book I have that touches on the subject, it's not great. It's the best one I have. It's the one I mentioned earlier. It's called Terminator and Philosophy. I'll Be Back, Therefore I Am. It's actually a very funny read. It's obviously talking about the subject through the lens of the Terminator series. Uh, there are plenty of books that I've wanted to get my hands on for quite some time on the subject, but I haven't got around to it, unfortunately. So that's all I have to recommend.
Well, I mean, if you want to get some ideas on AI and such, there's always Isaac Asimov. And as a science fiction writer, he is nevertheless a very good and thorough philosopher on the subject. And he's still relevant from what I've read so far on researching AI. The Foundation series as well poses interesting scenario you get when you are able to rather accurately predict the future and what may result from that. No spoilers there, of course it's an old ass series, but Isaac Asimov is always a good read on the subject of AI.
Great. All right. With that said, let's go ahead and move on to our final topic for this discussion, and that is something that you've actually noticed within the skeptical community, a problem that you've noticed, and that is the propensity of skeptics to lack skepticism. If you could explain in detail what you've noticed in the skeptical community, why it's problematic, and if you could give a few examples so that our listeners can better understand.
Well, this is a very, very tricky subject because you're dealing with communities composed of individuals. Some of these communities have very rabid followings. Some of them are very much Poe's law. You're not sure if they actually are skeptical communities or if they're just masquerading as one for funsies. A perfect example of this currently is RationalWiki. And as an example of this, in my circles, there's a lot of YouTube anti-feminists and men's rights activists and so forth. And I've listened to countless hours of arguments, some bad, most of them spot on. I've done a lot of my own research into early literature on feminism, gender studies, women's studies. I mean, I go to college myself, and I see these things all the time. So, using some popular members from that as an example for RationalWiki, looking up the article for Sargon of Akkad. Do you know who Sargon is?
Yeah, I'm familiar with him. Do you mind briefly explaining his focus for the listeners?
Well, originally I came across him for his Gamergate videos, which he mostly made to highlight the media in-group bias and the fact that places like Reddit, 4chan, a whole host of other places outright banned the discussion of ethics in gaming journalism. And usually on the justification that Gamergate was somehow sexist, because apparently criticizing a woman for sleeping with someone writing an article about her game is sexist. Now, that's something that actually comes up quite frequently. I don't have any on-hand examples of it immediately, but if you go watch some of Sargon of Akkad's videos, you'll find plenty of examples of this. Or tons of other videos in the Gamergate community. It's hard to miss, really. So that's generally what he's been doing recently, as Gamergate has kind of resolved its thing and dropped a bit out of favor. Well, not out of favor, but they kind of accomplished what they set out to do, for some part. So he moved on to criticizing feminism.
Right.
Because the harshest critics of Gamergate were the internet feminists. And most of the people that Gamergate ended up criticizing for unethical behavior came out saying, "I'm a feminist, how dare you?" A good example of this, I suppose, is Sarkeesian. So this is most of what Sargon of Akkad does. He does response videos, he does some commentary videos, mostly remarking upon current events, and general bullshit that the media will send out there. And he does it usually in a rational way.
So what's the relevance of this to the skeptical community?
Well, do you know what RationalWiki is?
Actually, no.
Rational Wikipedia, I will quote them for you. About RationalWiki, our purpose here at RationalWiki includes 1. Analyzing and refuting pseudoscience and the anti-science movement, documenting the full range of crank ideas, explorations of authoritarianism and fundamentalism, and 4. Analysis and criticism of how these subjects are handled in the media. So from that manifesto, there is a lot of implied skepticism here, because their whole thing is about refuting, debunking pseudoscience and anti-science. One of their random featured articles on my page right now is about homeopathy. And you read the article on homeopathy, and there's a little bit of mockery going on in there, but there's also actual citations and evidence of its lack of efficacy, things like that. But it goes in detail describing its irrationality. So it doesn't just say, there's no evidence of this. The people who maintain these pages go in detail saying, okay, if this was actually true, here's what you would find. Here's what we don't, but we don't find this, So they do have a lot of examples, go into a lot of detail, there's a lot of mathematical graphs, fun things like that. Then you go on to the article on Sargon of Akkad, and here's where RationalWiki breaks down. Their description of Sargon of Akkad is he's described as yet another anti-progressive reactionary YouTube pundit with a Venus-shaped chip on his shoulder. Credulous gators, which is one of their in-group terms, gamer gators, they spell it like alligator, swallowed his propaganda about how Sarkeesian is the Napoleon of crime, or some such. This is an actual quote from the article. Now, of course, as it's a wiki, everyone is free to edit. But what you'll find is when you go looking for articles on other gamergators or anti-feminists or other YouTubers within that sphere, is they're all in the same vein of grotesque misrepresentation of these individuals. So you have what's called RationalWiki, and it's going out of its way to bastardize and to attack in every way conceivable people that whoever the editors are disagree with. which is not particularly rational. And it's just, you see this even more when you look at the talk pages for these articles too. Because there are people there trying to make the articles, more accurate or less biased. But those people get shot down. So there is a community here who are actively pushing a narrative about these people, often with very few actual citations. And so it reads a lot more like a left-leaning Encyclopedia Dramatica at times.
So is your main concern the misrepresentation of certain people's views and also the sort of in-group out-group mentality that they cling to? Is that a good summary?
I would suppose so, but a good example of what I'm talking about is then go on to look at RationalWiki's article on feminism. Unlike the previous article I mentioned on Sargon of Akkad, where they pretty much take the piss out of him, or unlike the homeopathy article, where they're describing how it's wrong, how it's pseudoscience, and so forth.
Right.
This is a very lengthy article that is focused primarily on describing feminism as a good thing, and defining it in such a way exclusively to where there is really no other option. Feminism equals equality, period. And it even goes on to describe it as a movement that has helped topple authoritarian governments, ignoring the fact that many of its leaders in America are using authoritarian powers to achieve their own ends.
So do you disagree with them that feminism is a force for good?
Well, I don't particularly have very distinct opinions on this in terms of what activism might do for good in, say, other countries where women are actively disenfranchised. But the problem stems from its ideological axioms. Patriarchy theory, for example. This is very much a case of using facts to suit your theories. Patriarchy theory doesn't actually describe anything scientifically useful. You can read all day and all the textbooks you want on patriarchy theory, but at no point is it actually justified as legitimate. It's always looking for data to justify its existence. So it's making facts to suit its theory.
Now, just to prevent any listeners from uh, inaccurately accusing you of this, obviously you do share the belief that men and women should be treated equally in society insofar as that's possible. Your problem isn't with that core assumption. It's with some of the more irrational, unjustified beliefs that some subset of the feminist movement take. Is that correct?
I probably more than most modern feminists wish they would be treated equally. Because, this gets into the whole sphere of the anti-feminists remarking about how actually women already do have equal pay as mandated by law. There is no pay gap. There's an earnings gap because of the choices women make. And things like that. But this whole RationalWiki article is devoted to propping up feminism on a pedestal, and then using that pedestal to punch down at groups like the MRAs, which are just the men's rights activists. These are the people who want to end circumcision, who want equal representation in family courts. And here's the quote they use to illustrate an MRA by Judge Grady, Just or Unjust. I have no idea who that is personally, actually. But here's the quote. Equality, give me back that vote, woman. Let me guess who's at work and busting his ass all day. Let me guess who makes the most money. I know, it's Chuck. It's the man. And so on and so forth. So they are painting MRAs who generally just want equal rights for men, or body integrity for men, or equal representation in the courts for men, or discrimination against men to end. They're painting them as something that's inherently sexist. And the question really is, if your position is to advocate for somebody's rights, how does that make them uniquely opposed to your own rights? Especially when so many of them, most of the MRAs actually define themselves as libertarians. So you have a whole group of people, a whole demographic based on the idea that your rights end where they infringe upon mine. And they're saying that simply by existing, this group is, trying to take away something from feminism. But this is an example of what I mean about rational or skeptical communities not doing their due diligence. There's a very obvious ideological bias here, especially with how they paint the critics of their core group of ideas.
Yeah, if I could provide another example of, in my view, the skeptical community uh, not exactly living up to that name. Uh, One thing I often see, it's not a huge deal, but I often see non-religious people and non-believers and atheists and skeptics and so forth overstepping their bounds and basically shifting the burden of proof onto themselves with matters of religion. So what I often see is declarations such as "there is no God." I think the position that should be taken instead is there is insufficient evidence to justify belief in the existence of a God, and for this and a number of other reasons, we can take the position that belief in God is unjustified. But the positive declaration, there is absolutely no God. Again, not all people do this. It's just some subset that I see doing this. I think that's just taking it a bit too far, and I think they should exercise a bit more caution and instead just honestly admit that we don't know for certain what the answer to this question is, and not shift the burden of proof onto them in this way.
Well, shifting the burden of proof onto trying to prove a negative is rather a humorous scenario,
Yeah.
especially when, as you illustrated, your position as an atheist is inherently going to have to be one of skepticism. However, that does not necessarily apply to other areas of life. A YouTuber who a lot of anti-feminists like Sargon have criticized for this is Steve Shives. Steve Shives was a YouTube atheist. Now he does a lot of videos advocating for feminism, and he was part of what was called the Atheism Plus movement.
Yeah, I've heard about that recently.
And he's actually getting quite a lot of unsubscribers for it. And this is a guy who was a very good skeptic and atheist who would debunk religious claims and arguments. And then he makes wildly inaccurate claims about women or men or feminism or misrepresenting statistics that have the exact same logic that certain religious arguments do. It's so bad it's to the point where people who are formerly his fans are saying, feminism is now your religion.
So can you explain, both for listeners and for me, what exactly Atheism Plus is? Because I actually don't know much about it.
I don't know much directly either, except through social osmosis, but essentially it seemed to be this movement to incorporate feminism into atheism. So to incorporate social justice into atheism. And it's a very bizarre proposition to me, because the whole thing about just being an atheist is, well, it's a religious thing.
Yeah, it's an isolated position as well.
Exactly. It's a very specific type of argument, a very specific type of position. And so Atheism Plus was kind of like, well, let's take these humanistic values and let's identify as, Atheism Plus. The only problem is, it fell apart due to infighting, especially on the part of people who are trying to advocate for men's rights within Atheism Plus, because it just became what's known as like social justice warriors kind of came in, and these are the extreme authoritarian progressives who want to control things like control thought or control argument or silence discussion on controversial topics. And it's so bad with these types of people that they're kind of referred to as the regressive left.
Yes.
And so this is another example of a problem where you'll have these communities of people who are skeptics about a specific thing and who are unable to apply that to other areas of their thought. Moving on to the next example, though.
Sure.
We have an even better one known as LessWrong. And
that's a website, right?
Yes, LessWrong is a website. And its tagline is a community blog devoted to refining the art of human rationality.
Very lofty.
Well, in my mind, the first thing I think of is, well, they're a bunch of philosophers then. That's essentially what philosophy does. So there's bound to be lots of articles on, logic and reason and things like skepticism and doubt. Instead, what you see is a massive in-group bias and this bizarre worship of the website's founder. And I have personal experience with them too, because a couple of years ago, I think about 3 years ago or so, I was in their IRC chat. And I was having a discussion with them that actually got me banned temporarily, because I wouldn't let the argument drop because the answers were insufficient. I mean, the reasons weren't good. Unfortunately, I cannot find the log of this IRC, so I can't quote it directly. So forgive my memory.
Could you paraphrase it for us?
Essentially, the position that got me banned was, I was saying it is entirely possible for an individual to be rational. Oddly enough, the consensus opinion on the IRC, and the IRC is composed of most of the in-group members, so the most active contributors tend to hang out there. Their position was, LessWrong is an impossible ideal. You cannot be a rational human being because reasons. Like, I never actually got them to argue their point. It was kind of like a dogma. And here's the real fun part. If you go on RationalWiki and search LessWrong, you will get an argument dedicated to criticizing the website LessWrong. If you go on LessWrong and search RationalWiki, you will get blog articles dedicated to criticizing RationalWiki.
Ah.
In both of those articles, they are criticizing one another for the exact same thing.
And what's that?
Generally not being what it says on the tin. This one person's blog post by the name of Conquistador that I read says it's about as inaccurate as Wikipedia. And of course, LessWrong. Let's see. Okay, here we go. LessWrong. The content of LessWrong is occasionally articulate, innovative, and thoughtful. However, the community's focused demographic and narrow interests have also produced an insular culture that is heavy with its own particular jargon and established ideas. Sometimes these ideas might benefit from a better grounding in reality. And it goes on to describe how the website kind of worships the founder, Eliezer Yudkowsky. I probably pronounced that wrong. So essentially, in-group biases, articles that make no sense, denial of criticism, and you go on LessWrong, and they say most of the articles consist of haphazardly arranged facts and, a bunch of fluff and stuff that doesn't make any rational sense. So they do criticize one another for the exact same thing. And LessWrong, in the Conquistador little blog post on there, describes it as that it's used as RationalWiki is used as ammunition to aid in winning debates. RationalWiki, same thing about LessWrong. Now, the thing about LessWrong is, not only was I banned for having an argument on LessWrong, on the IRC anyway, and this was 3 years ago, so I have no idea who's there anymore, and no interest in it, really. But there's a good example on RationalWiki of where LessWrong goes terribly wrong, and that was with the website's founder. He posted a blog post called "Politics is the Mind Killer." And he describes politics as utterly futile to have a discussion about, and the website shouldn't have any talk about politics whatsoever. LessWrong also is a community of people who are usually on the transhumanist side of things, too. So he goes on to talk about artificial intelligence and such. Now, if you go past the website founder's blog post and look for disagreement in the comments, you will find a lot of the regulars on LessWrong essentially saying, no, website founder says we're not having this discussion, therefore you're not having this discussion. My question is that particularly rational? But considering the website's in-group on the IRC didn't agree with me that it's possible to be a rational human being, and memory might be failing me a bit, and I might be misrepresenting that position a little bit, but you see where I'm going here.
Yeah, that's just kind of strange that they would argue that it's not possible to be rational, given that the website seems to be devoted to, as they said, honing the art of rationality, or however they put it. So do you recall any specific reasons they gave why a person couldn't be full? Was it fully rational, or just rational in general? Were they pointing at cognitive biases or problems of absolute knowledge? Do you remember anything like that?
Mostly at cognitive biases, logical fallacies, and so forth. The problem I found is that most of them don't actually have any literate knowledge of philosophy, or systems of logic, or really anything that current academia might teach you at the higher levels, like at a graduate level. And so what you'll find in a lot of these articles is a lot of speculation and not much real philosophy. And they're absolutely convinced as well, apparently, that you can't be rational because cognitive biases. Now, I mentioned earlier in the AI thing the studies on wisdom and self-reflection. Those find that the better you are at self-reflection, essentially what they test for wisdom, the less likely you are to fall prey to cognitive biases. Which was the sort of position I was arguing about 3 years ago, just in slightly different language. Of course you can be a rational human being if you train yourself in these practices. And that's quite obvious, I think, in my definition of philosophy as a rational doubt or doubting inquiry.
Right.
But that's not what these people partake in. So I mentioned a few examples so far, and there's also some specific things about the community of LessWrong too, like their AI box experiment. And it's really quite funny to go on RationalWiki and look up articles on LessWrong, because they generally describe LessWrong rather correctly from my point of view. And then you go on LessWrong, look at RationalWiki. They generally describe RationalWiki correct from my point of view. So they're very good at being skeptical about other people. Very bad at being skeptical about themselves.
I see. Yeah. So, so are you stressing the importance of members within the skeptical community in general just taking a closer look at some of their own beliefs and some of their own presuppositions and questioning those?
It seems to be, well, my general thing is self-doubt. I am very much a fan of Socrates. The reason I chose the username Socrates was that every time I see it, I'm reminded, oh right, Socrates doubted everything, including his own knowledge. So to me, the name is not a point of ego or just because I'm a fan of Plato. I'm actually not much of a fan of Plato, but the idea of an individual who is continuously in an experience of self-doubt is a very important lesson, I think, for anyone who wants to make rational arguments or have arguments, because it helps tremendously in avoiding those cognitive biases. Or like in this example, where these communities are very great or very good at criticizing other communities until they meet their ideological opponents, like in the case of how the RationalWiki article on feminism is glorifying everything that is modern feminism and shitting on everything that isn't. Or in the case of LessWrong, where I had the conversation in the IRC where the idea of a actual rational human being is utter bunk to them because reasons. I never did get a clear reason out of them, and that was really upsetting to me because LessWrong has the whole tagline of improving, refining the art of human rationality. So I expected, okay, I'm going to have some good arguments here. Didn't have any good arguments. Didn't even have any arguments. And generally, I find that the longer a community exists for skepticism or what have you, the more likely this is to happen, simply due to general human behaviors and in-group biases. So if you don't have somebody there who's constantly going to be contrarian or doubt you, you're more likely than not going to end up this way unless you take the extreme position of always trying to doubt yourself.
Right, and that's difficult to do.
And that's what I advocate doing. I very much advocate that we need a lot more people who are like Socrates. And, unlike Socrates, I actually know how to read and write, so I actually spend a lot of time reading and writing and trying to learn more things, because I doubt my own knowledge of things. And that's what drives me to open up 200 tabs in Firefox, and this is going to give me a headache by tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that might be a good note to end on. We should all doubt even the beliefs that we feel most confident in. We should always be willing to revise our views and opinions in the light of new evidence and better arguments. Do you have anything else to add on this point?
Well, there's usually something that crops up regarding this, regarding ideas and how they relate to your ego. My position on this is that ideas are not a part of your identity. Ideas are just something that you should be rationally holding in your mind as an argument. If you cannot actually argue an idea successfully, you have no reason to hold it. And therefore, just let it go. It doesn't actually really change who you are, more often than not. I mean, who you are is largely a big hodgepodge mess of biology and emotions and chemicals. And people hold on to their ideas with far more fervor than they actually need to. They hold on to it like it actually is a part of them, and that if they let it go, it'll radically alter their universe. So I would say as an ending note to be more like Socrates and find out how to ask good questions, especially to yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. Well, this has been a very productive and interesting conversation. I think we hit a lot of good points, and I hope the listeners enjoy this. I'd like to thank you for coming on for my first episode. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it.
Great. Well, we should do it again sometime.
Yeah, sure, anytime.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, I will head out for the night. Take care.
Have a good one.